13, the big day arrives. The sun shining brightly on the morning of the big day, but the ground was still white with snow and the air was very cold. Outside the gates of Wonka's factory, enormous crowds of people had gathered to watch the 5 lucky ticket holders going in. The excitement was tremendous. It was just before 10 o'clock. The crowds were pushing and shouting. The policemen with arms linked were trying to hold them back from the gates. Right beside the gate, in a small group, was carefully shielded from the crowd by the police, stood the 5 famous children, together with grown-ups who had come with them. The tall, bony figure of Grandpa Joe could be seen standing quietly among them, and beside them, holding tightly to his hand, was little Charlie Bucket himself. All the children, except Charlie, had both their parents and fathers with them, and it was a good thing they had, otherwise the whole party might have got out of hand. They were eager to get going, but their parents had to hold them back to prevent them from climbing over the gates. "Be patient," cried the fathers. "Be still. It's not time yet. It's not 10 o'clock. Behind them, Charlie Bucket could hear the shouts of people in the crowd as they pushed and fought to get a glimpse of the famous children. "There's Violet Bugard," he heard someone shouting. "That's her, all right. I can remember her from the newspapers." "And you know what?" somebody else shouted back. "She's still chewing that dreadful old piece of gum she had for 3 months ago. You look at her jaws, they're still working on it." "Who's the big fat boy?" "That's Augustus Loop." "So it is. Enormous, isn't he?" "Fantastic." "Who's the kid with a picture of the Lone Ranger stenciled on his wind cheater?" "That's Mike Tea-Tree. He's the television fiend. He must be crazy. Look at all those toy pistols he's got hanging on him." "The one I want to see is Veruca Salt." "All those toy pistols he's got hanging on him." "The one I want to see is Veruca Salt," shouted another voice in the crowd. "She's the girl whose father bought up 500,000 chocolate bars and made the workers in the peanut factory unwrap every one of them until she found the golden ticket. He gives her anything she wants, absolutely anything. She only has to start screaming for it and she gets it. Dreadful, isn't it? Shocking, I call it. Which do you think is her?" "That one over there on the left. The girl in the silver mink coat." "Which one's Charlie Bucket?" "Charlie Bucket? He must be that skinny little shrimp standing beside the old fella who looks like a skeleton. Very close to us, just there. See him?" "Why hasn't he got a coat on in this cold weather?" "Don't ask me. Maybe he can't afford one." "Goodness me, he must be freezing." Charlie, standing only a few paces away from the speaker, gave Grandpa Joe's hand a squeeze, and the old man looked down at Charlie and smiled. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock began striking 10. Very slowly, with a loud creak of rusty hinges, the great iron of the factory gates began to swing open. The crowd became suddenly silent. The children stopped jumping about. All eyes were fixed upon the gates. "There he is!" someone shouted. "That's him!" And it was.
Chapter 14. Mr. Willy Wonka. Mr. Wonka was standing all alone just inside the open gates of the factory, and what an extraordinary little man he was. He had a black top hat on his head, he wore a tailcoat made of a beautiful plum-coloured velvet, his trousers were bottle green, his gloves were pearly grey, and in one hand he carried a fine gold-topped walking cane. Covering his chin there was a small, neat, pointed black beard, a goatee, and his eyes were most marvellously bright. They seemed to be sparkling and twinkling at you all the time. The whole face, in fact, was alight with fun and laughter. and oh, how clever he looked, how quick and sharp and full of life. He kept making quick, jerky little movements with his head, cocking it this way and that, and taking everything in with those bright, twinkling eyes. He was like a squirrel in the quickness of his movements, like a quick, clever old squirrel from the park. Suddenly he did a funny little skipping dance in the snow, and he spread his arms wide and he smiled at the 5 children who were clustered near the gates, and he called out, "Welcome, my little friends, welcome to the factory." His voice was high and fluty. "Will you come forward one at a time, please?" he called out, "and bring your parents. Then show me your golden ticket and give me your name. Who's first?" The big fat boy stepped up. "I'm Augustus Gloop," he said. "Augustus!" cried Mr. Wonka, seizing his hand and pumping it up and down with terrific force. "My dear boy, how good to see you! Delighted, charmed, overjoyed to have you with us. And these are your parents? How nice! Come in, come in. That's right, step through the gates." Mr. Wonka was clearly just as excited as everybody else. "My name," said the next child to go forward, "is Veruca Salt." "My dear Veruca, how do you do? What a pleasure this is. You do have an interesting name, don't you? I always thought that a verruca was a sort of wart that you got on the sole of your foot. But I must be wrong, mustn't I? How pretty you look in that lovely mink coat. I'm so glad you could come. Dear me, this is going to be such an exciting day. I do hope you enjoy it. I'm sure you will, and I know you will. Your father? How are you, Mr. Salt? And Mrs. Salt? Overjoyed to see you. Yes, the ticket is quite in order. Please go in." The next 2 children, Violet Beauregard and Mike TV, came forward to have their tickets examined and then to have their arms practically pumped off their shoulders by the energetic Mr. Wonka. And last of all, a small nervous voice whispered, "Charlie Bucket?" "Charlie!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Well, well, well. So there you are. You're the one who found your ticket only yesterday, aren't you?" "Yes, yes, I read all about it in this morning's papers. Just in time, my dear boy. I'm so glad, so happy for you. And this? Your grandfather? Delighted to meet you, sir. Overjoyed, enraptured, enchanted. All right, excellent. Is everybody in now? 5 children? Yes, good. Now will you please follow me? The tour is about to begin, but do keep together. Please don't wander off by yourselves. I shouldn't like to lose any of you at this stage of the proceedings. Oh dear me, no." Charlie glanced back over his shoulder and saw the great iron entrance gate slowly closing behind him. The crowds on the outside were still pushing and shouting. Charlie took a last look at them. Then as the gates closed with a clang, all sight of the outside world disappeared. "Here we are," cried Mr. Wonka, trotting along in front of the group. "Through this big red door, please. That's right, it's nice and warm inside. I have to keep it warm inside the factory because of the workers. My workers are used to an extremely hot climate. They can't stand the cold. They'd perish if they went outdoors in this weather. They'd freeze to death." "But who are these workers?" asked Augustus Gloop. "All in good time, my dear boy," said Mr. Wonka, smiling at Augustus. "Be patient, you shall see everything as we go along. Are all of you inside? Good. Would you mind closing the door? Thank you." Charlie Bucket found himself standing in a long corridor that stretched away in front of him as far as he could see. The corridor was so wide that a car could easily have been driven along it. The walls were pale pink, the lighting was soft and pleasant. "How lovely and warm," whispered Charlie. "I know, and what a marvellous smell," answered Grandpa Joe, taking a long, deep sniff. All the most wonderful smells in the world seemed to be mixing up in the air around them. The smell of roasting coffee and burnt sugar and melting chocolate and mint and violets and crushed hazelnuts and apple blossom and carol and lemon peel. And far away in the distance, from the heart of the great factory, came a muffled roar of energy as though some monstrous gigantic machine were spinning its wheels at breakneck speed. "Now this, my dear children," said Mr. Wonka, raising his voice above the noise, "this is the main corridor. Will you please hang your coats and hats on those pegs over there and then follow me? That's the way, good. Everyone ready? Come on then. Here we go." He trotted off rapidly down the corridor with the tails of his plum-coloured velvet coat flapping behind him, and the visitors all hurried after him. It was quite a large party of people, when you came to think of it. There were 9 grown-ups and 5 children, 14 in all, so you can imagine that there was a good deal of pushing and shoving as they hustled and bustled down the passage, trying to keep up with the swift little figure in front of them. "Come on," cried Mr. Wonka, "get a move on, please. We'll never get round today if you dawdle like this." Soon he turned right off the main corridor into another slightly narrower passage. Then he turned left, then left again, then right, then left, then right, then right, then left. The place was like a gigantic rabbit warren, with passages leading this way and that in every direction. "Don't you let go of my hand, Charlie," whispered Grandpa Joe. "Notice how all these passages are sloping downwards," called out Mr. Wonka. "We are now going underground. All the most important rooms in my factory are deep down below the surface." "Why is that?" somebody asked. "There wouldn't be nearly enough space for them up on top," answered Mr. Wonka. "These rooms we are going to see are enormous. They are larger than football fields. No building in the world would be big enough to house them. But down here, underneath the ground, I've got all the space I want. There's no limit, so long as I hollow it out." Mr. Wonka turned right, he turned left, he turned right again. The passages were sloping steeper and steeper downhill now. Then suddenly, Mr. Wonka stopped in front of him. There was a shiny metal door. The party crowded round. On the door, in large letters, it said, "The Chocolate Room."
Chapter 15, The Chocolate Room. "An important room, this," cried Mr. Wonka, taking a bunch of keys from his bucket and slipping one into the keyhole of the door. "This is the nervous center of the whole factory, the heart of the whole business, and so beautiful. I insist upon my rooms being beautiful. I cannot abide ugliness in factories." And we go there. But do be careful, my dear children. Don't lose your heads. Don't get overexcited. Keep very calm. Mr. Wonka opened the door. 5 children and 9 grown-ups pushed their way in, and oh, what an amazing sight it was that now met their eyes. They were looking down upon a lovely valley. There were green meadows on either side of the valley, and along the bottom of it there flowed a great brown river. What is more, there was a tremendous waterfall halfway along the river, a steep cliff over which the water curled and rolled in a solid sheet, and then went crashing down into a boiling, churning whirlpool of froth and spray below the waterfall. And this was the most astonishing sight of all. A whole mass of enormous glass pipes were dangling down into the river from somewhere high up in the sky. They really were enormous, those pipes. There must have been a dozen of them at least, and they were sucking up the browny muddy water from the river and carrying it away to goodness knows where. And because they were made of glass, you could see the liquid flowing and bubbling along inside them. And above the noise of the waterfall, you could hear the never-ending sucking sound of the pipe as they did their work. Graceful trees and bushes were growing along the river bank, weeping willows and alders and tall clumps of rhododendron with their pink and red and mauve blossom. In the meadow there were thousands of buttercups. "There!" cried Mr. Wonka, dancing up and down and pointing his gold-topped cane at the great brown river. "It's all chocolate, every drop of that river is a hot melted chocolate of the finest quality, the very finest quality. There is nothing chocolate in there to fill every bathtub in the entire country, and all the swimming pool as well. Isn't it terrific? And just look at my pipes. They suck up the chocolate and carry it away to all the other rooms in the factory where it is ended. Thousands of gallons an hour, my dear children, thousands and thousands of gallons." The children and their parents were too flabbergasted to speak. They were staggered, they were dumbfounded, they were bewildered and dazzled. They were completely puzzled over the hungersness of the whole thing. They simply stood and stared. The waterfall is most important, Mr. Wonka went on. It mixes the chocolate, it chunks it up, it pounds it and beats it. It makes it light and frothy. No other factory in the world mixes it chocolate by waterfall, but it is the only way to do is properly. The only way. And do you like my trees? He cried, pointing with his stick. And my lovely bushes? Don't you think they look pretty? I told you I hated ugliness. And of course they are all edible, all made of something different and delicious. And do you think my meadows? Do you like my grass and my buttercups? The grass you are standing on, my dear little ones, is made of a new kind of soft, minty sugar that I just invented. I call it swudge. Try a blade, please. Please do. It's delectable. Automatically, everybody bent down and picked one blade of the grass. Everybody that is except Augustus Globe, who took a big handful, and Violet, before tasting her blade of the grass, took the piece of word recording breaking chewing gum out of her mouth and stuck it carefully behind her ear. Isn't it wonderful? Whispered Charlie. Hasn't it got a wonderful taste, Grandpa? I could eat the whole feed, said Grandpa Joe, grinning with delight. I could go around on all four like a cow and eat every blade of the grass in the field. Try a buttercup, cried Mr. Wonka. They are even nicer. Suddenly the air was filled with the screams of excitement. The scream came from Rosa's soul. She was pointing frantically to the other side of the river. Look! Look over there! She screamed. What is it? He's moving. He's walking. It's a little person. It's a little man down there below the waterfall. Everybody stopped picking buttercups and stared across the river. She was right, Grandpa, cried Charlie. It is a little man. Can you see him? I see him, Charlie, said Grandpa Joe. Exactly. And now everybody started shouting at once. There is two of them. My gosh, so there is. There is more than two.
Chapter 16. The Oompa Loompas. Oompa Loompas everywhere. Imported direct from Lumperland, said Mr. Wonka proudly. There's no such place, said Mrs. Salt. Excuse me, dear lady, but, Mr. Wonka, cried Mrs. Salt, I'm a teacher of geography. Then you'll know all about it, said Mr. Wonka. And oh, how terrible country it is. Nothing but thick jungle infested by most dangerous beasts in the world. Horned wogglers and snot-wankers and those terrible wicked wangdoodles. A wangdoodle would eat up to 10 Oompa Loompas for breakfast and then galloping back for a second helping. When I went out there, I found the Oompa Loompas living in the tree houses. They had to live in tree houses to escape from the Wongadoogles and the horse wonglers and the snooze wranglers, and they were living on green caterpillars, and the caterpillars tasted revolting, and the Oompa Loompas spent every moment of their days climbing through treetops looking for other things to mash up with their caterpillars to make them tastier. Red beetles, for instance, eucalyptus leaves and the bark of a bong tree, all of them beastly, but not quite as beastly as the caterpillars. Poor little Oompa Loompas, the one fruit they longed for more than anything was cocoa beans. But they couldn't get it. An Oompa Loompa was lucky if he found 3 or 4 cocoa beans a year, but oh, how they craved them. They used to dream about cocoa beans all night, talk about them all day. You only had to mention the word cocoa, and the Oompa Loompa would start dribbling at the mouth. The cocoa bean, Mr. Wonka continued, which grows on the cocoa tree, happens to be the one thing from which all chocolate is made. You cannot make chocolate without cocoa beans. The cocoa bean is chocolate. I myself use Billy's chair. Of course I mean it, I said. You can have chocolate as well. Chocolate tastes even better than cocoa beans because it's got milk and sugar added. The little man gave a great whoop of joy, threw his bowl of mashed caterpillars right out of the window. It's a deal, he cried. Come on, let's go. So he shipped up them all over here, every man, woman, child in the Oompa tribe. It was easy. I smuggled them over in large packed cars, with holes in them, and they all got here safely. They were wonderful workers. They all speak English now. They love dancing and music. They are always making up songs. I expect you'll hear a good deal of singing today from time to time. I must warn you, though, that they are rather mischievous. They like jokes. They still wear the same kind of clothes they wore in the jungle. They insist upon it. The men, as you can see for yourself, cross the river wearing bearskins. The women wear leaves and the children wear nothing at all. The women use fresh leaves every day. Daddy, shouted Veruca, the girl who has everything she wanted. Daddy, I want an Oompa Loompa. I want you to get me an Oompa Loompa. I want an Oompa Loompa right away. I want one to take home with me. Go on, Daddy, get me an Oompa Loompa. Now, my pets, her father said to her, we mustn't interrupt Mr. Wonka. But I want an Oompa Loompa, squeaked Veruca. All right, Veruca, all right, but I can't get it just for you this second. Please be patient. I'll see if we can get one before the day's out. Augustus shouted, Mr. Gloop. Augustus, sweetheart, I don't think you can get better. Augustus Gloop, as you might have guessed, had quietly sneaked down to the edge of the river, and he was now kneeling at the riverbank, scooping hot, melted chocolate into his mouth as fast as he could.